All right, folks, I'm ready to get started here. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to our 5th meeting together, the start of our 3rd week together. 3 weeks. 3 weeks is a long time. We're not at the end of the 3 weeks yet, but we are in the 3rd week of roughly 15 or 16. It's about a 5th of the way through the semester, folks. It's happening. The semester is happening. Things are happening. It's important to just be very realistic with yourselves about that. Ideally, you've already mapped out the semester for yourselves. You know what's coming up. And you know that things are going to be coming up very soon. And so that part of the semester, that part of this whole process is starting up. And so every moment that you're not in the middle of that, like where it's like time crunch and only so much time to do everything, is an opportunity for you to avoid getting into that tight space. So again, I hope you're making the best of your extra time, and you guys are getting down the material you're learning in here as well as your other classes as we're moving along, so that when exams come up, you're not just scrambling to get it all down at once, and you've actually learned some stuff and you were able to process things in the right way. Hope you're doing that. If you're not doing that, do it. Change your approach. Make this work out better for you. Make this whole process more comfortable for yourself. And ultimately, get the kind of results that you need to get, the ones that not only prove to the world what you're capable of, but just prove to yourself what you're capable of, and continue sort of generating that foundation of like confidence and knowledge about what you can do and what you're able to take on in this world, which is so important for you guys to generate while you're here. That ability to just know you can handle anything. It's invaluable, and you got to be always kind of cultivating it and sort of pushing it out of yourselves, because it's in there. It's in all of you. You just need to, again, get it out. All right, so we are at a point where we've covered about 3 chapters so far. We covered the first chapter, which had to do with like the basic principles that underlie all the logic and approach of economics in general. And then we covered chapter 2, which was an introduction to the main tool of an economist, which is the model, a simplified version of the world that can explain different aspects of it that we're interested in studying. We looked at the comparative advantage model via the production possibility frontier. We looked at the schematic model of the economy, the circular flow diagram, which, by the way, you don't have to know that one inside and out. That one, you just kind of have to just be aware of what it's telling you, because it's a good sort of reference in your head for like how things sort of move through an economy and how it's all connected. But definitely the comparative advantage and the production possibility frontiers model, know those very well. And then we, in chapter 3 last week, covered our supply and demand model, which is like the most important model in this class. It's like the basic go-to for understanding how markets operate, how the interaction of sellers and buyers leads to an outcome that's relevant in a market, a price, a quantity combination. And it is a reflection of a very specific kind of market, a competitive market. A lot of markets aren't competitive. Some markets are what we call monopolies, where there's only one seller, and that changes the nature of the outcome and how everybody operates within it. We'll talk about those later in the semester. And there's some in-between cases of what we're seeing, what we saw in the supply and demand chapter, the competitive model versus the monopoly. There's in-between cases of markets that have varying characteristics of both. And each type of market will have a different outcome. But this basic model that we covered in chapter 3 is the one that you can always, like I said last time, kind of reference in your head to sort of figure out, well, what's going to happen in a market when, something changes? Like what we're seeing right now with the stock market. You could analyze that with the demand and supply model. You can say, well, what's being bought and sold is like these stocks, right? These like these ownership shares of firms. And we can say that expectations are causing people to sell. Like people know that the market is going down. So they expect that in the future, the prices are going to be lower. And so therefore today they want to sell because they know they can get a higher price. And so therefore at any given price, the supply curve shifted to the left and people sold more. And that caused the price to go down. And then obviously that causes more people to react to that. And then you get that downward spiral, which is what's going on right now. People are just like reacting to things. That's That's why economics is an art versus a science. If you get a degree in economics, you get a Bachelor of Arts rather than science, because it is an art trying to kind of rein in the uncertainty of what happens in markets, because sometimes it goes crazy like it's going right now. Like people just start acting like on their emotions rather on what they should be acting on, which is like what they logically understand to be happening. And the problem is that once that starts happening, then that becomes a legitimate reason for people to start actually reacting to that and selling off what they can in order to maintain the value of the things that they bought at a price ideally that they either bought it for or higher, right? And so again, that's why this whole thing, the economy itself is erratic. Everything we do in this class is a basis. It's a simple way of introducing it to you, but it is a basis for all types of analysis that goes on throughout the business world, be it at the government level, be it at the firm level where companies are doing stuff, be it at like hedge fund levels with big investment funds and banks. At any level, all the analysis that's done is based on economic models, and we introduce them in a simple way to you here, and then they're obviously more complicated in practice because there's more variables involved and you need more complicated math. But really the core ideas that sort of underlie all analysis that goes on in the world is introduced in this class to you. And so it's of relevance to you, like I said, even if you're not going to become a business person. Like just kind of getting this stuff. And yeah, it can be somewhat tedious sometimes, like going through the details of it and kind of being explained how it works and like trying to get that down. Yes, but anything in life that is worth knowing is going to take some work, and it's not always going to be pleasant to undergo that process of learning. In the end, though, what you wind up learning is going to be of value to you, and it is worth your sacrifice. It is worth you being uncomfortable, not being the happiest, like kind of going through the process, because in the end, you will wind up being happier because you'll be a more educated, a more sort of confident, and ultimately powerful person in the world that can get good opportunities, that can get you some good stuff in life that will make you happy from this point all the way till the end if you work hard enough. So again, it's all important. Everything's relevant, and the world is chaotic, and we do our best with it. It was ultimately the point I was trying to make. Like our models try to predict stuff, but then sometimes people start acting crazy, and then things that we try to predict don't mean anything for that moment. But then generally they do mean stuff, and so therefore it is worth your time to learn this stuff, even though chaos does take hold every now and then. So what we're going to do today is, even though we finished chapter 3 last time, I want to really emphasize like your understanding of like the model that we did last time, how things change in the model when different sides of the market are affected. So we'll go through some of that stuff slowly and clearly for you so that you can have one more pass at it. So you, again, ideally, if you're paying attention and you're plugged into the course and you're doing work outside of class, because it doesn't all happen in class, more time has to be spent outside of class than in class if you really want to learn everything in this class and your other classes. But nonetheless, I want to make sure I give you a little bit more time here with me to get this model down, because it is seminal to everything we do moving forward. So we'll go through a couple of practice questions, kind of analyzing how the market will change when different stuff changes on either side of the market, either consumers or producers. And then we will begin talking about chapter 4. Chapter 4 talks about what's called the consumer and producer surplus. So in our market model, we have an equilibrium, right? A place where the quantity that people are willing to sell is the amount that the people are willing to buy. If we're outside of that equilibrium, we talked about the forces that bring the market to equilibrium. I'll highlight that once again today. So at that equilibrium price, there are gains from trade. And so how do we measure the gains from trade in a market model? Well, we do it through analyzing the consumer and the producer surplus. So this is just kind of advancing your understanding of the model from chapter 3 and taking more information from it. Chapter 5 will deal with this other thing called elasticity, which is also more information that we can extract from the market model. So like I said, like 2 weeks ago, the supply and demand model is the basis for about 5 different chapters that we're going to cover. And really, in more advanced courses, it's all covered in like 1 or 2 chapters. So if instead of thinking about it in terms of like, oh, all these chapters, like just try to focus on the connectivity of the ideas and how they all kind of flow together and they're connected, and there is a logic that kind of unifies it all so that it doesn't feel overwhelming and it makes sense to you. Like it makes sense to you as a body of information that ultimately can then, you can use as a basis for understanding the complexities of markets. So we'll talk about consumer surplus and the demand curve, and then producer surplus and the supply curve, how consumers benefit from the market, how producers benefit from the market. But before we do that, let's take a step backward, go back to looking at the market model and examining what happens when either the supply or the demand side changes. So again, this is our basic market model. You have the price of the good on the y-axis always, and the quantity of the good on the x-axis. The demand and supply curves are two separate curves, but we put them together in the market model, and they give us more insights than we would gain if we had them separately. But if it confuses you to see them both together, think about them separately. Put them on separate graphs, really understand what they mean individually, and then understand what they mean together. Well, here we have them together. We've got our downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. Why is that important to point out? Because they follow the law of demand and the law of supply. The law of demand says that as prices go up, people buy less. As prices go down, people buy more. That's why we've got a negatively sloped demand curve. Here's price, here's quantity. As price goes down, so as we're moving along the curve, price is going down, quantity demanded is going up. On the supply side, it follows the law of demand, the law of supply. As the price goes up, people buy more, people sell more. As the price goes down, people sell less that are selling, the producers. And so that's the positively sloped characteristic of this curve. That's what it's telling us. It's telling us how sellers behave with respect to price changes. So again, as the price goes down, as we're moving from left, as the price goes up, we're moving from left to right. The price is moving up. People are selling more. Quantity supplied is increasing. If you're above the equilibrium, then you have what's called a surplus. So if the price is above the equilibrium price, then you have a lot of sellers that are willing to sell and only a few buyers that are willing to buy. So you take the price and you go to the demand curve. At that point, that tells you how many people are willing to buy the good. And at this point, at a point above the equilibrium point where the two curves intersect, you're going to have a lot more supply than demand, and therefore all the sellers that can't sell their goods that nobody's buying at that high price will start lowering their prices. As they lower their prices, people that weren't willing to buy at a higher price will start buying, and that'll get us to equilibrium. If the price is below the equilibrium, then you're going to have a shortage. There's going to be a lot more people willing to buy than are willing to sell. So any price below the equilibrium, you're going to have a bunch of people willing to buy, but only a few sellers that are willing to sell, because the supply curve represents a willingness to sell based on the producer's costs. So at a low price, only certain producers are having their costs met, and so those are the only people willing to sell. And so at a low price, you don't have a lot being sold. You have a lot more people willing to buy. So the people willing to buy that can't get the stuff they want start bidding up the price. Start saying, well, I'll pay more. And then as they're willing to pay more, the sellers that couldn't sell now are like, well, now I can sell at this higher price because it's meeting my cost. So more is being provided. You got quantity supplied increasing, and that gets us to the equilibrium. That behavior of everybody kind of working in their own self-interest gets us to the equilibrium. So whether you're at the top of the market model, a price above equilibrium or a price below equilibrium, the behavior of all the participants will get the market to equilibrium. And so that's why we say this is the market clearing price. It's the equilibrium price. It's the price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. It's the best the market can do. And so that is the point that is represented there. And so then we talked about, well, what happens when something is affecting either the demand or the supply side? Well, we always assume the market is in equilibrium as a starting point because that's where it's always looking to get to, that point of rest. So we assume the market is at that point of rest and it is at equilibrium. And then something changes. So let's say that there's an increase in demand. Why is there an increase in demand? Well, we talked about last time. There's various things that can affect the demand of a market. One of the things is like if people overall are making more money. If wages are going up, then at any given price, people are going to buy more. In this case, it's cotton. So let's say it's cotton. At any given price, people are going to buy more cotton. That means demand will increase, meaning the curve shifts to the right. So if you think about it, the market was at equilibrium down here. Demand increased. The price is still down here. At that price now, you have that many sellers, Q1, willing to sell. And if you go over to the demand curve, you have a lot more people demanding the good at that price now. And so there's going to be, what's this when you have more demand than supply? It's a shortage, right? There's going to be a shortage. Excess demand is another way to call it. And so when that happens again, you have all the buyers that are not getting the thing they want, that want it, start bidding up the price. That brings more sellers in. So because demand increased, quantity supplied increased, meaning that as the price started going up, the sellers were willing to supply more. So for them, the only thing that's affecting their behavior is a change in price. So it's just a movement along the demand curve, the supply curve. So we say there's an increase in quantity supplied because demand increased, and that got us to the new equilibrium price and quantity. So again, an increase in demand leads to an increase in quantity supplied, and that gets us to a higher equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity. You're going to have to be able to do this kind of analysis in this class using this model. Being told either something's happening on the demand side or the supply side, and you're going to have to tell me, well, how's that going to affect the market? Is it going to affect demand or supply? How do you describe that? Are we talking about quantity supplied increasing or supply increasing? You have to know the difference between the two. And then what's happening to equilibrium price and quantity? Is it going down? Is it going up? I'm going to need you to tell me that. I might need you to reproduce this graph for me and draw that for me, or I might need you to simply describe it for me, one of the two. But again, that's what this class is. It's like teaching you the language of economics. The language of economics is the terminology, and then it's also our tools that we use to communicate with. So you have to learn both. So something like this, you don't memorize like my graph that I did here. Like you don't memorize this exact thing. You understand what it all means. You understand how it works, and then you are able to then use it to analyze something else, or maybe the same thing. But the point is to know how to use it and be able to either show me that you know how to use it, or explain that you know how to use it, or whatever. And in the end, if you actually learn it, then you'll have it. You'll have it with you. Like I said, it's a very practical model to kind of have in your back pocket to explain how things in this world are affecting you. All right. Anyway, everything that I just described that. What happens when the supply curve shifts? So again, here we've got the market in equilibrium. In this case, supply is decreasing. Let's say that this is the market for cotton. And for the producer, the price of his workers has increased. So at any given price now, he has to pay his workers more because maybe the minimum wage went up or something. And so at any given price, the producer is willing to supply less. Like he will only supply less. And so that decreases the supply, shifts the supply curve to the left. At the old equilibrium, price, here's the demand curve, here's our new supply curve. And so you've got a lot more demand than supply. You've got excess demand, you've got a shortage. And so again, that's going to lead all the people not getting the good they want to bid up the price. It's going to lead more producers to sell more. And so that's going to get us to our new equilibrium price and quantity. And as I mentioned last time, when supply changes, price and quantity move in opposite directions. But when demand changes, price and quantity move in the same direction. So here, demand increased, and so price and quantity both increased. If demand had decreased, then price and quantity would have both decreased. But here, because supply decreased, price increased and quantity decreased. So that always happens when supply changes. Like price moves in one direction, quantity moves in the other direction. They move in opposite directions. Another thing to just kind of note. But again, you can just use the model to figure all this stuff out. If you can clearly set up the equilibrium for yourself in your head or on a piece of paper by drawing it for yourself, then you can just do all this either in your head or on paper, whatever, and figure it out. The most important thing is to remember that price is on the y-axis and quantity is on the x-axis. If you get those wrong, then all your insights might be wrong as well.
So for example, on this graph, what makes the quantity demand increase when the supply increases?
Because the suppliers are now only willing to supply the same amount as before at a higher price. So supply has decreased. Another way to think about it, at any given price, suppliers are supplying less. So at the old equilibrium price, because supply decreased, now you've got this many people wanting the good, Q1, but if you go on the old equilibrium price to the new supply curve, then there's only this much being supplied. So there is a shortage, right? And so therefore, all these people that are willing to pay more start bidding up the price because they're fighting for the scraps, right? Not enough to go around. And that brings more, that has the sellers willing to sell more. And then that ultimately gets us to the equilibrium. All right, so a decrease in supply led to a decrease in quantity demanded. Because again, something other than price affected the supply, so that shifted the entire curve, and we describe that in words as saying supply decreased. Because that happened, quantity demanded, because that happened and price started to go up, quantity demanded increased. And that's how we describe it on the demand side, because it's only the price that's affecting the behavior on the demand side, and the only reason the price is changing is because something other than price changed on the supply side. All right, and that's same stuff. And then we talked about how when there's two effects that happen at the same time, there's always going to be one variable, either price or quantity, that you're not going to know whether it's going to move up or down. And therefore, it's okay to say that. So if we're saying that there's an increase in demand and an increase in supply at the same time, both curves are shifting to the right at the same time, when that happens, the amount that the equilibrium quantity will change will certainly be clear, and it will increase. But what's going to happen to price will be ambiguous. It will be unclear. We do not know what happens to the equilibrium price because it depends on how much the curve shifted. They both shifted at the same time. If you shift them a little bit more than maybe less, then that will give you a higher price versus a lower price. I showed you last time at the end of class how that can result in an ambiguous result. Depending on how much you shift the curves, that could lead to either a higher price or a lower price, which means that you don't know what's going to happen with price because we don't say the curve is shifting by 2 inches. We don't say that. We just say demand increased, supply increased. And so you might increase them both a lot. I might increase them both a little. We're both doing the right thing, but you might result in a higher equilibrium price than I might result in a lower equilibrium price, which means that what will actually happen to equilibrium price is unclear. It's ambiguous. And so you don't have to memorize this chart. It's just about being able to use the model to kind of analyze the situation. Just know that whenever two things are happening at the same time that are affecting both sides of the market, that will always lead to at least one ambiguous result. Either price will be ambiguous or quantity will be ambiguous. And so just be able to analyze that and tell me which one is ambiguous and which one is clear. And I did show it. OK, I have it here. So this is me just reviewing stuff, and sometimes I forget what I review. All right, so I showed you here. Here we have two opposing forces that are being acted upon the market. Here demand is increasing and supply is decreasing. But I only decreased supply a little bit, and I increased demand a lot. And that got me to this equilibrium price and quantity, where equilibrium quantity went up and equilibrium price went up. And in this case, the demand dominated, meaning that we had the demand shift was a lot bigger. Nobody told me to make it bigger. I just did because that's how much I shifted the curve. But let's say that I shifted the supply curve more than I shifted the demand curve. In that case, we see equilibrium price goes up. So in both cases, equilibrium price goes up. So it's clear that equilibrium price goes up when supply decreases and demand increases. That is clear. But we see here that equilibrium quantity went up when I shifted demand a lot, but when I shift supply a lot, then the equilibrium quantity actually goes down. And so therefore, I don't know what's going to happen to equilibrium quantity. It is ambiguous. And that is all you would have to say. It's ambiguous. It's unclear. I don't know. But I do know price will definitely increase when supply decreases and demand increases. So it's important to know not just what the model can tell you, but also what it cannot tell you. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that there's something wrong with the result, because there's a limitation on what the model can tell us. Alrighty, couple of more practice sort of questions that have to do with demand and supply shifts. Explain and graph the effect of the following developments on equilibrium price and quantity in the market for steak. Describe the effect on both sides of the market. So we're talking about just the market for steak here. So the first thing is that we're being told the price of chicken, a substitute for steak, falls. So think about it. In the price for steak, in the market for steak, steak and chicken are considered substitutes by the consumers. The price of chicken has gone down. So what happens in the market for chicken? Not demand. Quantity demanded, because it's the price changing. Okay, so people are buying more chicken in the chicken market, and that means they're probably going to substitute away from steak to chicken, because chicken is now relatively cheaper. And so what's going to happen in the market for steak? Is it quantity demand? The market for steak, because the price of chicken went down. Say that again? Demand will go down. Exactly. Demand decreased in the market for steak, because it wasn't the price of steak that was changing. If it was the price of steak that was changing, then that would change the quantity demanded of steak. But it was the price of chicken, a substitute for steak. So here's the market for steak. Here's our equilibrium. Price of chicken went down. At any given price now in the market for steak, people are buying less. So if the price of a substitute falls at any given price, consumers will demand less of the good. The demand curve shifts to the left. We have a decrease in demand. And what happens on in the supply for steak? Not supply. Quantity supplied, right? Because again, demand shifted in this market for steak. And so again, think about the old equilibrium here. Here's that price. Now at that equilibrium, you've got a lot more supply than is being demanded. We know that's above our actual new equilibrium. And so if there's more being sold than being bought, what do we have? We have a surplus, absolutely. And so when there's a surplus, the sellers start to lower their prices. So quantity supplied goes down in response to a decrease in demand, which gets us to a lower equilibrium price and a lower equilibrium quantity. I know it can be tedious, like just kind of making sure you get it right to like describe it properly or whatever, because you have to. Like you have to be able to describe it right, because if you don't, then it won't be clear, and then they will always be questionable. Like, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the quantity demanded or the demand? Which one's changing? Yeah.
So basically you're saying that quantity demand has to do with the price. The demand is the inverse or the opposite of what is going on. So
It's not the inverse or opposite. It's an effect on the market, on the demand side, that has something to do with other than price. Anything other than price is affecting the demand.
the demand.
Is affecting demand, yes.
Quantity demand is, or quantity supply is the actual price.
Yes, because the curves are a relationship between price and quantity demanded and price and quantity supplied. That's what the curves represent. Just a bunch of points that are price-quantity combinations. When we looked at that table, the supply and demand schedules last time. Yeah.
So the price also goes down.
So the equilibrium price went down and the equilibrium quantity went down. And we moved down to the new equilibrium because demand went down in the steak market because the price of a substitute went down. Chicken. Yeah.
Any shift means that there's a change in supply or demand, and any movement means there's a change in quantity, supply, and quantity.
Correct. All right, so quantity supply decreased because demand decreased. All right, B, due to a severe drought, the price of corn feed for cattle increases. Is that going to affect the demand or the supply side? Supply, exactly. You're a producer. You always have to kind of think about like who's being affected here. Well, if we're talking about like the stuff that feeds cattle, which ultimately becomes steak, then that's me as a supplier having my costs go up, right? So what's going to happen to supply then? Not quantity supplied.
Demand is going to increase.
Shift to the supply curve, which, how do we describe that? A decrease in supply. Very good. That's exactly right. And then what happens on the demand side? Supply is going down. So we'll look at it graphically. So here's our equilibrium, right? Where the market was before anything happened. All of a sudden, the price of feeding the cattle goes up. That means I'm a seller, and all the other sellers on this curve aren't going to be willing to supply the same amount at the old prices. We're willing to supply less at the old prices. And so at any given price, an increase in the price of feed increases my production, the cost of my production, which means at any given price I will supply less, and so will everybody else, which means supply will decrease. The supply curve shifts to the left. And we can see our new equilibrium price and quantity are going to be here, right? What happens to equilibrium price? What happens to equilibrium quantity? What happened on the demand side? Quantity demand decrease. Quantity demand decreased. Remember, we're moving from this point here to this point here. That means the quantity that's going to be bought and sold is less, right? So that means that the amount that people were buying is now going to be less. That means quantity demanded is less at that point than it is here. So supply decreased, and that caused equilibrium price to increase and equilibrium quantity of steaks to fall, and that means that quantity demanded decreased. All right. The technology for steak production improves. At the same time, consumer incomes rise. Assume that steak is a normal good. So let's think about them, the effects in turn, and then we'll think about them together. So let's talk about first on the consumer side. Consumer incomes rise. So on the consumer on the demand side, how is that going to affect the demand? Increase the demand. Increase the demand. People at any given price are going to be willing to buy more steak because everybody's making more money now. All right. On the supply side, so remember, the reason that was the case was because the steak is a normal good. So remember the distinction between normal and inferior good. It's just basically reflecting how the people in a particular market feel about the good in relation to their income, right? If it's a normal good, as incomes go up, people buy more of those goods, those normal goods. And as their income goes down, people buy less of those normal goods. But with an inferior good, it moves in the opposite direction. If I think of something as an inferior good, if income goes up, I buy less of it, and my income goes down, I buy more of it. All right, so we said it was a normal good, so that's why, everything worked out right on the demand side. All right, the technology for steak production improves. When technology improves, what does that do for a producer? Lowers your costs, right? So that means what happens? So not quantity supplied. Supply increases, right? It's something other than the price of the steak that's changing. Here it's the cost to produce steak. My technology has improved. My cost per unit has gone down. And so now I am willing to supply more steak at any given price. And so I do. And so supply increases. So when technology for steak production improves, suppliers will supply more steak at any given price. When consumer incomes rise and a good is normal, at any given price, consumers will demand more. So again, this is two different effects. And so we know that at least one of the variables is going to be ambiguous. We're not going to know what's going to happen to one of them, but which one? Well, we got to analyze it. So here I just moved both of them some amount, and that got me to the point where, I know demand increase and I know supply increase. And when they both increase, we're going to have price that's ambiguous. But again, you don't have to memorize this table. You can work it out with your graph. So here I, again, shifted the curves in arbitrary amount, meaning I just randomly chose how much I was going to move them to the right. And that caused equilibrium quantity to go up. So it is clear that equilibrium quantity rises, but because of how much I shifted the curves, equilibrium price went down. Now let's say I had shifted the demand curve a little bit more to the right. And again, like nobody told me to shift it a certain amount. I just randomly chose some amount. So I could have easily chosen this amount or that amount. And because when I do that, when I shift it a little bit more, we see that the equilibrium price goes from going down to going up. Then therefore I have no idea what's going to happen to the equilibrium price, and therefore the effect on equilibrium price due to these two effects is ambiguous. But it is clear that equilibrium quantity goes up no matter what. So that is clear, and so that is what you would say.
So you said that the demand increases when the consumer income rises. I'm a little confused because I thought it would be the quantity demand would increase, because you said that when the quantity demand or the quantity supply increase or decrease, it has to do with price.
Right.
So it's saying the consumer income rises, but like that doesn't have to do with price.
Exactly. Exactly. No, it's fine. You got to work it out sometimes. You learn this for the first time. It's perfectly natural to be a little confused about some stuff every now and then. Just make sure you get it all worked out in your head so that you don't get confused when it's important.
So like if you ever get a problem that says like consumer income increases, will it always just be like unclear what equilibrium price happens?
No, that's not the case. It will be unclear when there are two different effects happening at the same time. And so this is a problem where you had consumer incomes rise and the technology for steak production improve. So there was something happening on the demand side and the supply side. When there are two effects happening at the same time on both sides of the market, then at least one of the price quantity, the equilibrium price or quantity results will not be clear, will be ambiguous. And that is what you should take away from that. So again, it's not about memorizing my specific problems that I present to you. It's about understanding the model, how it works, and being able to use it to analyze different situations. All right, so there's that. One more. All right, let's do it. How will the market for bicycles be affected by an increase in the price of gasoline and an increase in the desire for exercise? So here's two effects. Think about the price of gasoline. So we're talking about the market for bicycles. Is that going to affect the demand or the supply side? Demand, exactly. How are bicycles and I guess cars, we're talking about cars, right? Cars that use gasoline. How are those related? Substitutes. Substitutes, very good. All right. An increased desire for exercise, what side of the market is that going to affect? Demand as well, right? With that, we're talking about like people's tastes, right? We talked about how people's tastes might be one of the shifters of demand, and that was one of the ones we listed as the main ones. So here we're being asked, how will the market for bicycles be affected by an increase in the price of gasoline and an increase in the desire for exercise? And then there's 4 different options for how the equilibrium price and quantity can move. We won't go through them here. Let's just go through the model, examine it, and then we'll pick the right answer. So here is our market for bicycles. Here it is in equilibrium. Increase in the price of a substitute. So what is that going to do to demand here? Right. Increase demand. Yes. Shift it to the right. Increase demand. Both right ways of describing it. So demand will increase. The demand curve will shift to the right. What's going to happen to equilibrium price? Equilibrium quantity? Very good. So due to an increase in demand, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity went up. What happened on the supply side? Quantity supplied went up. Quantity supplied went up. All right. All right. Change in the tastes for bicycles, and that's also going to increase the demand. So again, People are now more willing to use bicycles in general because it's become more fashionable. People don't want to drive as much because of climate change, all these things. And so at any given price, people are willing to use more bicycles, so they do. So that also increases the demand curve to the right. And so that leads us to the same result. So they will both lead to the equilibrium price and quantity of bicycles to increase. All right, folks. We'll be talking about this market model a lot, obviously. But just make sure you understand the ins and outs of it, be able to analyze different situations with it. So good idea is just to kind of reproduce it for yourself, try to draw it without stuff, and then kind of go through the list of all the things that might shift demand and supply, and just kind of draw out how that might affect the market. Just practice with it, and then you'll get it down. It'll be again easy and something you can always carry with you to analyze markets in general. Not just stuff for this class, just like in general. You hear something's going on in the world, how's that going to affect the thing that you buy? How's that going to affect the price? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? I don't know. Let me find out. It'll help you. All right, let's talk about consumer and producer surplus. So again, there are gains from trade. That's one of our important sort of principles from the interaction of all of our decisions and in the economy. And so our market is a good way of kind of highlighting that. At equilibrium, you have a bunch of people that are willing to sell and buy the good, but there's a bunch of people that are willing to buy the good at a higher price that get to pay a lower price, and there's a bunch of people that get to sell the good at a certain price that would be willing to sell it at a lower price because their costs are actually lower. But because everybody's interacting in these markets and you get this equilibrium price being set, you're going to have a bunch of people that are going to pay less than they're willing to pay, and then there's going to be a bunch of people that are going to sell at a higher price that they need to sell at. And so they're all going to benefit from the market. Those are the gains from trade, and we can measure that via what's called the consumer and producer surplus. All right, so let's look at the consumer surplus first, kind of highlighting the nature of the demand curve and how that relates to the benefits they gain. So along the demand curve, everybody has a willingness to buy. A consumer's willingness to pay for a good is the maximum price at which he or she would buy that good. So again, you all buy stuff every day, but there are certain things that you would pay a lot more for, right? Like even if you go to a club or something and they're charging $20, you love that club, you would pay $40, but you only have to pay $20 because that's the going price. So this table shows 5 potential buyers of a used book that costs, let's say, $100 new, listed in order of their willingness to pay. So you've got Alicia, Brad, Claudia, Darren, Edwina, and Alicia's willing to pay $59 for the book, Brad $45, Claudia $35, Darren $25, and Edwina $10. The question is, how many of these 5 students will actually buy a used book? Well, that depends on the actual price, if their willingness to pay is being met. So if the price of the used book is $55, then that's only going to meet Alicia's willingness to pay. She's willing to pay $59. She only has to pay $55. She'll buy the book, but obviously Brad, Claudia, Darren, and Edwina will not. But if the price, let's say, were to be $40, then Alicia and Brad would both have their willingness to pay met, and thus they'll both buy, but Claudia, Darren, and Edwina will not. So the information in the table can be used to construct a demand schedule for used books. That's the market we're talking about here, like a used book, like a book from the bookstore that someone sold back. So this is how a demand curve looks when you only have 5 people in the market. The smooth demand curves we've been looking at represent a market of just a huge amount of people, an indefinitely large amount of people. But in this very specific example, we're looking at a world where only Alicia, Brad, Claudia, Darren, and Edwina are willing to buy the book. So we can derive this demand curve with it. So at $59, only Alicia would buy, so that's 1. At $45, Alicia and Brad would buy, so that's 2, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so because, again, we're considering only a small amount of consumers, this curve doesn't look like the smooth demand curves of Chapter 3. For the analysis of consumer surplus, it doesn't matter whether the demand curve is step-shaped or whether there are many consumers, making the curve smooth. So the shape of the curve doesn't matter to understand consumer surplus. Starting off at this really simple example helps you to kind of really understand what consumer surplus is before we go back to our normal smooth demand curve. All right, let's talk about consumer surplus then and how it relates to the willingness to pay. So there's this thing called individual consumer surplus. It is what's called the net gain to an individual buyer from the purchase of a good. It equals the difference between the buyer's willingness to pay and the price they actually have to pay in the market. So suppose the campus bookstore makes used textbooks available at a price of 30 bucks. So the going price is 30 bucks. So Alicia, as we know, has a willingness to pay of $59. So she's willing to pay $59. She only has to pay $30. And so the difference between $29 and $30 is her net gain. It's her individual consumer surplus. It's her excess willingness to pay. It is how she benefits from the market. It is her gain from our trade. So that's her individual consumer surplus. Brad also has an excess willingness to pay. He's willing to pay 45 bucks for the book, only has to pay 30. 45 minus 30 is $15. So his net gain is $15. That is Brad's individual consumer surplus. And then, of course, Claudia. She is willing to pay 35, only has to pay 30. And so the difference between what she's willing to pay and what she has to pay is 5 bucks. That is her individual producer surplus. And then, of course, you've got Darren and Edwina down here. Neither of their willingness to pay are being met by the price, and so they just don't buy. The total sum of everybody's excess willingness to pay in the market is known as the total consumer surplus. It's the sum of the individual consumer surpluses of all the buyers of a good in a market. So in this example where the price is 30 bucks and you've got Alicia, Brad, and Claudia each having some consumer surplus, then the total consumer surplus is going to be the sum of Alicia's consumer surplus, which is 29 bucks, plus Brad's, which is 15 bucks, plus Claudia's, which is 5 bucks, and that is going to equal, $49. So in this very simple market where there's only 5 people buying, and the thing being bought and sold is 30 bucks, and that means only 3 people are willing to buy, they all have some excess willingness to pay, what's called the individual consumer surpluses, which we can combine to be the total consumer surplus in this market. And ultimately, we just call it consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is often used to refer to both individual and total consumer surplus. So when we're talking about consumer surplus in this class, we're talking about basically just either the individual or the total, depending on whether or not we're talking about just one person or an entire market. If I'm talking about the entire market, which is generally going to be the case, and I mentioned consumer surplus, I'm talking about the total consumer surplus. $49. It's all these segments here.
No, not the total.
The consumer surplus is the total consumer surplus. Yeah. All right, so the previous figure illustrated the following general principle. The total consumer surplus generated by purchases of a good at a given price is equal to the area below the demand curve but above the price. The same principle applies regardless of the number of consumers. So here we have a very general market for widgets, just like a general kind of gadget. And here's a demand curve, downward sloping, reflecting the law of demand. And it's smooth because there's just like a huge amount of buyers in this market. So we don't need to delineate each one. There's just a bunch of them. Maybe 1,000, maybe 1,000,000. I don't know. It's a big market. It's a lot of people. Let's say the equilibrium price is 20 bucks. That's the price that everybody has to buy and sell the good at. That's the market clearing price. There's a supply curve here. We're not seeing it, but it's intersecting at this point. So equilibrium quantity is 90 and equilibrium price is 20. So you've got all the consumers on this demand curve. All of these consumers are willing to pay more than 20 bucks. There's someone here, they are willing to pay about 60, so 60 minus 20, they have an individual consumer surplus of about 40. There's somebody over here, they're willing to pay about 40 bucks. and they only have to pay 20, so they have about a $20 consumer surplus. And of course, there's like a ton of other people along this demand curve, all having individual consumer surpluses, all combined together into the total consumer surplus, which we just call consumer surplus. And so regardless of what demand we're looking at, the area below the demand curve and above the price will always, the price that people are paying, will always represent the consumer surplus in that market. So again, the area here, the consumer surplus here is the area equal, is the area below the demand curve but above the price, and it is computed by just taking the area of this shape, which is a triangle. So you have to know the formula for a triangle, 1/2 the base times the height, to calculate the actual consumer surplus. So this is the area of a triangle again, 1/2 the base times the height. So you've got 1/2 the base, which is equal to 90, the quantity demanded at the price. So that's the base of the triangle, 90. And then the height is the difference between the intercept for our demand curve minus the equilibrium price. So that's 80 minus 20, which is 60. And then plugging that in, you're going to get 540 divided by 2. What is that? 270? 2,700. So the total consumer surplus in this market at a price of $20 is $2,700. Why is that important? Because if you're a firm, if you're like a seller in a market, and you can calculate the consumer surplus, you can figure out strategies to capture that consumer surplus. And we'll talk about that more towards the end of the semester, but that's what some firms do. If they're able to, and we'll talk about the circumstances that will allow a firm to do that, if they're able to, they will come up with strategies to try to get as much of this from consumers as possible. Because they know that, like, even though they only have to charge $20, that people are willing to pay more. So they try to figure out ways to get that money from us, and they do. Sometimes you'll look at, like, one example is just like Costco, Home Depot, like that price that they charge every year for membership. Like, that is generally going to be a reflection of like the consumer surplus in the totality of markets that they sell stuff in. Kind of representing how much more people are willing to buy than what they're actually paying for their goods and services. So again, there's like a very practical use to this concept. But right now in this class, as far as like what we're doing, understanding the market model, this is a way of like kind of highlighting how we can measure the gains from trade of a bunch of buyers and a bunch of sellers interacting in a market that gets to an equilibrium. So this is how we can say, well, this is how consumers benefit. They benefit $2,700 worth of not having to pay what they're willing to pay. All right, let's look at how changing prices will affect the consumer surplus. So it's often important to know how much consumer surplus changes when the price changes. The same approach we've used to derive consumer surplus can be used to answer questions about how changes in price affect consumers. So again, let's go back to that original example. Used book, Alicia, Brad, Claudia, Darren, and Edwina. $30 was the going price, and we had 3 people that had consumer surplus, Alicia, Brad, and Claudia. We calculated it, and that's what it was. But let's say the bookstore dropped the price to $20. So the bookstore dropped the price to $20. Now, everybody's going to have more consumer surplus that was already buying, plus you're going to have new people willing to buy that weren't willing to buy before because their willingness to pay wasn't being met. And so they're going to have some consumer surplus as well. So there's going to be some additional consumer surplus from new people buying, and there's going to be additional consumer surplus from those that were already buying when the price drops. And it works in the opposite direction when the price goes up. So again, here, Alicia, Brad, and Claudia, each of them, this like blue area represents how much more now consumer surplus they had because the price went down. Each of them now is getting $10 more in consumer surplus. So that's $30 more in consumer surplus. So the total increase in consumer surplus is the sum of the shaded areas, which is $30 from the people that were already buying. And then there's Darren, who now is buying, who was not buying before. His willingness to pay is 25. He only has to pay 20. The difference between 25 and 20 is $5. That's his individual consumer surplus, and that is also added to the total addition in consumer surplus. So that's $5 there, and so the total consumer surplus has increased in the market, and we describe that as like the welfare of the market. So when we use the term welfare in this class in economics, we're talking about like how good are the markets working and how we can measure that in consumer and producer surplus. So because the consumer surplus went up here, we say that there was an increase in welfare, and it was by $35 because the price went down to $20. So again, it's all very mechanical, but again, there's a lot of information in like this very simple model. And again, we're not done. Next chapter, there's going to be more information. Like there's a lot of information you can get from the very simple interaction of two lines on a graph, if we just have them mean something, and they do mean something. And so there's a lot that can be taken from that analysis, and it can be very useful in the practical world, and it is. All right, so the figure shows the same result for the case of the smooth demand curve, the demand for iPads. Let's say the price was $5,000 before, and then it dropped to $1,500. So at a price of $5,000, the consumer surplus is just this little triangle up here. People are buying at $5,000, 200,000 iPads. And only these people are having their willingness to pay met. And so this area, this triangle, gives us the consumer surplus. Price falls to $1,500. All these consumers now have their willingness to pay being met all the way up until this like last person here, where their willingness to pay is exactly being met. And so, as far as what's happening to the total welfare of the market, the consumer surplus in the market, we have an increase in the amount of consumer surplus the existing buyers get. In this case, you've got 200,000 people, and now all of them are going to gain $3,500 in consumer surplus each. And then, of course, all the people that were not buying that now are able to buy are going to get some consumer surplus as well. And so that's the area of this even darker blue triangle here. So this is the consumer surplus gain from new buyers, and this is the increase in consumer surplus to the original buyer. So that's what happens when the price goes down. And then you have the opposite effect when the price goes up in a market. You have some loss in consumer surplus from the consumers that drop out of the market, and then you have some loss in consumer surplus from the ones that stay in the market at the higher price. So you can analyze it in both directions. So again, as before, the total gain in consumer surplus is the sum of the shaded areas, the increase in the area under the demand curve, but above the price. If the price of a good were to rise instead of fall, we do the same analysis in reverse. All right, let's jump to the other side of the market, producer surplus. So just as some buyers of a good would have been willing to pay more for their purchase than they actually have to pay, some sellers of a good would have been willing to sell it for less than the price they actually receive. So let's look at the relation between cost and producer surplus. So a seller's cost is the lowest price at which he or she is willing to sell a good. Right? You're a seller. It costs you a certain amount to produce a unit of what you're selling, and so you're not going to want to sell it below that price, because you're operating at a loss in that case for that unit, and you don't want to do that because you're looking for profits. So that's the mindset of the producer, right? That's what the supply curve represents, like how producers are thinking, and all of you can intuitively think how producers are thinking, and that's why it's really easy to put yourself in the mindset of either the consumer or the supplier on either side of the market, to examine a lot of these things, to really kind of work out the problem and figure out like what is the result of like, things happening in the market. All right, so again, each individual seller will have an individual producer surplus. That's the net gain to an individual seller from selling a good. It's equal to the difference between the price received and their cost. So the table shows the prices at which different students would be willing to sell their books. Let's say Andrew's willing to sell for $5, Betty 15, Carlos 25, Donna 35, Engelbert 45, let's say. And even though they don't have, let's say these are books that they bought from the market, from the bookstore, and they use them in the class. And now they're willing to sell them back to their class. So they don't really have a cost for the actual book to make the book. But remember, in this class, we're talking about costs. We're always talking about opportunity costs, the sum of implicit plus explicit costs. So they don't have an explicit cost to supply the book. They're not actually making the book. But they do have an implicit cost, and that is that in the future they might need the book. And so one of them, Andrew, probably is not going to need the book, and so the time he'd have to spend looking for the information probably not be a lot. So maybe his cost would be about $5. So that's his implicit cost, and that's what we're talking about in this particular example. Maybe Carlos would value the book. Maybe it's an econ book, and he's going to be a business major. So he's going to sell the book back, but he'll probably need to reference the book at some point in the future. And so it'll take him a little bit more time to find the information, and he'll probably be looking a lot more time. So his time will probably be worth more, so his cost is a little higher. So in this example, the costs represent their implicit costs to supplying the book. But in general, when we're talking about a producer supplying, we're talking about their opportunity costs, both the explicit and implicit costs. And obviously, most suppliers, when they're supplying a book, have to make the book. They have to pay for workers to put the book together. They have to pay for the pages. They have to pay for the binding, etc. So, just in this simple example, when we're talking about costs, it's just the implicit part of it. And that's something that you always kind of have to keep track of in this class. Costs always are opportunity costs, implicit and explicit costs. And so it can be either of the two or the sum of the two, depending on what's being considered. I just have to be clear about that just to be complete. Some people might actually question that. Anyway, so the price reflects the seller's opportunity cost of not having the book in the future. So again, those are their costs. Those are their seller costs. Those are the lowest price which either the guys or the girls are willing to sell their book at. So just as we derive the demand curve from the willingness to pay of different consumers, we can derive the supply curve from the cost of different producers. So again, supply curve is going to be upward sloping, meaning as the price goes up, more people are willing to sell. So again, every seller is going to have an individual producer surplus. The difference between their seller's cost, their willingness to sell, and the price they actually get to charge. And so the sum of all of those will be the total producer surplus, the sum of the individual producer surpluses of all the sellers of a good in a market. As in the case of consumer surplus, we can add the individual producer surpluses of sellers to calculate the total producer surplus. And of course, in general, we don't talk about individual or total producer surplus. When we're just describing producer surplus, we just call it producer surplus. So economists use this term to refer to both individual and total producer surplus. But when you're introducing these concepts to people, it's good to kind of talk about individual and then total. But then in the end, we're just talking about producer surplus and consumer surplus. Alrighty, so let's assume that the campus bookstore is willing to buy all the used copies of the book. The students are willing to sell at a price of $30. So again, at a price of $30, you've got Andrew. His cost is being met. Betty's cost is being met. And Carlos's cost is being met. So at a price of $30, the quantity supplied will be 3 books. And of course, all of them are going to have some individual producer surpluses. So Andrew, 30 minus his cost, which is 5. So he's going to have an individual producer surplus of $25. Betty, willing to sell at 15 because that's her seller cost, gets to sell at 30, so she's got an individual producer surplus of $15. And then Carlos, he's willing to sell at 25, gets to sell at 30, he's got an individual surplus of $5. So the total producer surplus in this market, the producer surplus in this market is the sum of the 3, which happens to be, in this case, $45. All right, so again, we have a general rule for determining the total producer surplus from sales of a good. The total producer surplus from sales of a good at a given price is the area above the supply curve and below the price, the equilibrium price. So this rule applies to both examples like this one, where there's a small number of producers, and also the normal case that we've been looking at, the smooth, positively sloped supply curve. When we're looking at producer surplus in a normal case, it is again measured as the area below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. So here's a market for wheat. Here's our upward sloping supply curve reflecting the law of supply. As prices go up, quantity supply goes up. As prices go down, quantity supply goes down. Law of supply, positively sloped supply curve, price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. The figure shows how producer surplus depends on the price per bushel. In this case, the price is $5. That's our equilibrium price, meaning there's some demand curve we're not seeing that's crossing the supply curve at this point. Equilibrium quantity is 1 million bushels of wheat in this market at a going price of $5 per bushel. The benefit to the farmers from selling their wheat at a price of $5 is their producer surplus, which is equal to the shaded area in the figure. So again, that is how we can calculate the gains from trade to the sellers, right? Sellers in a world without markets would each have to just kind of choose their own prices, and they're likely priced somewhere around their own costs. But in a world where there's just like a huge amount of people buying and selling, we get to interact in markets, we get to set an equilibrium price, and so there's going to be a bunch of sellers that are having their sellers' costs met, and a lot of them will have that producer surplus. But of course, there's all the sellers beyond the price whose costs aren't being met, and so they don't sell, and so they are not participants in the market. Let's look at how changing prices affect producer surplus. So again, here is the producer surplus that we were just looking at. A change in price alters it, but the effect is opposite. When you have a fall in the price on the demand side, that will increase the consumer surplus, but that will decrease the producer surplus. So if the price were to go up, though, then the producer surplus would go up, and then the consumer surplus would go down. So consider a rise in the price of the good, here from $5 to $7. Again, at $5, only these producers had their costs met, and so all the individual producers had individual producer surplus. The entire triangle represents the total producer surplus in the market. Again, you can calculate that by just taking the area of that triangle. The price goes up to $7. All of the sellers that were selling now have an even larger producer surplus. Each one has a $2 increase in their individual producer surpluses, and you can combine them all to be that increase in producer surplus, which is $2 times a million, so that's $2 million for the ones that were already selling. But now, because the price has gone up, there's a lot more units being sold in the market because a lot more costs are being met, and so all those sellers that are now selling in the market, they will have their own producer surplus that will be added to the total producer surplus. So other producers will enter the market because of the higher price. They will gain only the difference between the new price and their costs, and that is represented by this pink triangle here. All right, and let's do a quick homework problem. This is from our chapter 4 homework, question 5. By the way, I did send an email on Thursday about the homework. There are these graphing questions on the homework. They tend to rotate, and so what I have on my videos is not exactly what you're going to see there. Also, they are glitchy. Even though you might mark the right stuff, sometimes it'll take points off. Don't worry about any of that. Just do the homework, do your best on it. If you're missing a couple of points here and there, it's not going to matter. The whole point is for you to learn the concepts, learn the models, do everything you can to get as much information down as possible so that when you take exams, you do really well in the exams, because that's really where your grade is determined. When I'm calculating grades at the end of the semester, I'm not looking at slight points being missed on the homework, because that's not going to matter to me. If you're doing the homework assignments, then that's fine. That'll be satisfied. What's important is how are you doing on exams, because you don't have videos, you don't have the book, all you have is your brain. And that's the only way I can gauge if you're actually learning something in this class. So learn the stuff, do well in the exams, and don't worry about small points on the homework, because if you're doing the homework, it's going to be fine. You're going to get full credit for them. Yes, sir?
The graphing on the homework means she's blank.
Yeah, so that's another thing I mentioned on my email. It might be glitchy. It might not show up. You can either change browser, you can download Flash, or if it's still not working, call Launchpad customer support. Have them help you out. No, the homeworks are just multiple choice questions, and the exams, if you saw the practice exams, are made up of 15 multiple choice, which can come from any chapter, and then there's 4 open answer questions that might involve graphing, it might involve writing things out, it could involve any of those things. All right, folks, 5 more minutes. Let's work through this problem, and then let's call it a day. All right, so here we've got the market for burgers. It shows the weekly market for hamburgers in Irvine, Kentucky. If the price of burgers were to fall from $1.50 to $1, there is a loss in producer surplus. How much of the loss accrues because of the change in the quantity supplied is what the problem is asking us. All right, so here's the market in equilibrium. Demand, supply, equilibrium price, right? We understand why that happens. We know that if the price is above it, it's going to move down. If the price is below it, it's going to move up. It's a point of rest. It's where the market wants to go. It's the equilibrium. At that equilibrium, the producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So it's this entire triangle here. It's telling us that the price is going to fall from $1.50 to $1. Now, the price can fall because either supply increase or because the demand curve decrease, right? So again, this is the producer surplus before the price drop. Let's say that it's demand that went down. And so now we're down here at this equilibrium. That means the equilibrium price is now $1. That means that these are the only sellers that are going to sell, and this is the only producer surplus that's going to exist. The question is asking how much of the loss of the producer surplus accrues because of the change in quantity supplied. So remember, because demand decreased, there was a decrease in quantity supplied. That means that all these sellers here are not selling anymore. And so it's asking us how much of the loss in producer surplus is this amount here, this triangle that represents all of the sellers that are no longer selling in the market because the price is now not meeting their costs. So again, this red triangle represents the existing producer surplus at the new lower price for all the sellers that remained in the market. And this yellow triangle represents the loss in surplus from the sellers that are no longer in the market. And then this green box represents the surplus of the sellers that are still in the market that are now getting less producer surplus. All right, so to calculate this, we need the area of this triangle. It's 1/2 the base times the height. So 1/2 the base. What is the length of the base of this triangle? 200, right? Exactly. It's 200. What's the height? Right, 50. So whoever said 50 originally, I know you were looking at that as the base. You can. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as you know the formula, you know how to use it. If you know how to plug in the values the right way, regardless of how you plug them in, it'll be right if the answer's right. Anyway, so the base, let's say it's 200, the height is 50, and then of course times 1/2. So that tells us that the loss in producer surplus that accrues because of the change in quantity, in this case, is $50.
Can you repeat again? What is it? Loss in producer?
So it's the loss in producer surplus that accrues because of the change in quantity supplied. And again, it's that yellow triangle, and we can quantify by taking the area of it, and we calculate it to be $50. All right, folks, we're done for the day. Hope you guys have a good couple of days. I will see you guys on Thursday.